3 days after Russian tanks crossed into Ukraine, the United States Treasury made an announcement. They were cutting off Russia's two largest banks, institutions that together held more than half of all the money in the Russian banking system, from the U.S. financial system entirely. Every day, those banks were moving roughly $46 billion in foreign currency transactions, 80% of it in U.S. dollars. Overnight, most of that simply stopped. This was just the opening move. Within weeks, half of Russia's foreign currency reserves Russia had spent decades building specifically to survive a crisis like this, were frozen by Western governments, untouchable. Economists at the time used words like economic Hiroshima. The predictions were not subtle. Russia's economy would shrink by 10, maybe 15% within a year. The ruble would become worthless. This was supposed to be the end. It is now 2026. Russia has become, by a wide margin, the most sanctioned country in the history of the modern world. More than 16,000 individual restrictions, more than Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Myanmar, and Cuba combined. Roughly 70% of the entire Russian banking system now operates under some form of sanction, and the Russian economy did not collapse. For 2 straight years, it grew faster than almost every economy in Europe. So here's the question this video is going to actually answer, with real numbers, not vibes, not propaganda from either side. Did the West's plan fail, or is something else happening? Something that's only becoming visible right now in 2026, 3 years after everyone stopped paying attention? To understand how unprecedented this is, you need a comparison point. The international sanctions campaign against Iran, widely considered before 2022 the most aggressive sanctions regime in modern history, took roughly a decade to build up to around 3,600 measures. Against Russia, half of the eventual sanctions list was implemented in the first 10 days of the invasion alone. The coalition was enormous and, for once, genuinely coordinated. The United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, Canada, Switzerland, Japan, Australia, all moving in the same direction, in some cases faster than they'd ever moved before. Switzerland, a country whose entire brand for 2 centuries has been neutrality, abandoned it within days. 90% of these sanctions target individuals, oligarchs, officials, military leaders, and their families. Their yachts seized in Mediterranean harbors, their London townhouses frozen, their children's university tuition payments blocked. But the real structural damage was aimed at the financial system itself. Russia's 2 largest banks cut off from the US dollar system. The Central Bank of Russia barred from accessing roughly $300 billion of its own reserves held in G7 countries, money Russia had saved specifically as a war chest, now sitting frozen in Brussels and London and Washington, completely out of reach. And then there was the oil price cap, a coordinated agreement by Western nations to refuse shipping insurance and financial services to any tanker carrying Russian oil sold above a set price. Combined, the frozen assets and the price cap have denied Russia more than $500 billion it could otherwise have funneled into its war effort. By every traditional measure of economic warfare, this was the most powerful weapon ever assembled against a major economy. And then the Russian economy grew, not just survived, grew. In 2023, Russia's GDP expanded by close to 4%. In 2024, it grew again by nearly 5%. For 2 consecutive years, Russia's economy expanded faster than Germany's, faster than France's, faster than the UK's. How? The honest answer is the one that should genuinely unsettle you. War is, in the short term, an extraordinarily effective economic stimulus, if you're willing to pay almost any price for it. Russia's defense industry exploded. Rostec and the United Shipbuilding Corporation, Russia's 2 largest arms producers, both already under heavy sanctions, saw their combined arms revenues jump by 23% in a single year, reaching over $31 billion. Russia was manufacturing artillery shells at more than 4 times its pre-war rate and producing hundreds of long-range missiles annually. Every one of those factories needed workers. Every worker needed paying. Military salaries surged. A soldier's signing bonus in some regions exceeded a decade's worth of average local wages. That money flowed straight back into local economies, into shops, into housing, into restaurants and towns that hadn't seen this kind of cash injection in a generation. Meanwhile, the sanctions on energy exports, supposedly the crown jewel of the strategy, turned out to have a massive loophole. The The rest of the world still needed oil, and countries that hadn't joined the sanctions were happy to buy Russian crude at a discount and resell it. India and China became Russia's two largest oil customers almost overnight, absorbing the supply that used to flow to Europe. For 2 years, it genuinely looked like the sanctions had failed. Here's where this story gets genuinely interesting. Because this is the part almost nobody was talking about a year ago, and it's happening right now, in 2026. You cannot run an economy on wartime stimulus forever. Eventually, the bill arrives. And in Russia's case, the bill arrived in 3 parts. Part 1, inflation. Pumping enormous amounts of money into a labor market that was already near full employment. Partly because hundreds of thousands of working-age men had been mobilized to the front, created a textbook overheating problem. Wages spiraled, prices followed. Part 2, the response to that inflation. The Bank of Russia, led by Elvira Nebulina, the central banker we've covered before, the one who spent years quietly fighting this exact fire, hiked interest rates to roughly 16% to try to cool things down. Borrowing for ordinary Russian businesses became brutally expensive almost overnight. Part 3, and this is the one that matters most for ordinary Russians watching this video right now, the government's own revenues started falling. Oil and gas income, even with the China and India workaround, dropped by more than a quarter as global oil prices softened and the sanctions slowly tightened their grip on shipping and insurance. Russia's national wealth fund, the rainy day reserve, fell from around $117 billion in 2021 to roughly $31 billion by late 2024. The war machine still needs feeding. The state spent roughly $529 billion in 2025 and is projected to spend around $551 billion in 2026, essentially flat after inflation, meaning real military and state spending isn't growing anymore, even as costs rise. So where does the money come from? Taxes in 2025. Russia raised its value-added tax from 20 to 22%. It raised the corporate profit tax from 20 to 25%. It raised income tax. It raised the profit tax on oil transport to 40%. Every one of these increases lands eventually on ordinary households, through higher prices, through employers passing costs downstream, through a government quietly asking its own citizens to fund the war that for 2 years had seemed to be paying for itself. Let's go back to the question from the cold open. The West tried to financially destroy Russia. Did it work? The honest answer is not in the way anyone originally framed it, but also not nothing. If the goal was an immediate economic collapse, a 2022-style implosion within 12 months, that clearly did not happen. The Russian state proved far more capable of redirecting an entire economy by command than Western economists, who were modeling it like a normal market economy, expected. But if you zoom out to 2026, a different picture emerges. The growth numbers tell the real story. After expanding by close to 4% and then nearly 5% in 2023 and 2024, Russian GDP growth crashed to just 1% in 2025. The economy actually contracted slightly in the first quarter of 2026, its first quarterly decline since early 2023, and the economy ministry itself, in 2026, slashed its own growth forecast for the year from 1.3% down to just 0.4%. That is not the chart of an economy that defeated sanctions. That's the chart of an economy that's been running on a stimulant and the stimulant is wearing off, while the underlying disease, the sanctions, never went away. They were always there, in the background, slowly raising the cost of everything: imported machine parts, semiconductors for weapon systems, shipping insurance, access to global capital. Russia's deputy prime minister, presenting these downgraded numbers, described it as a normal stage for the economy, a correction after a period of high growth. That is true as far as it goes, but it conveniently leaves out why the growth happened in the first place and why the correction is landing on ordinary Russians through higher taxes rather than on the state through reduced military spending. So here's where this actually leaves us, heading further into 2026. The most sanctioned country in history did not collapse. It found a way to convert international isolation into a short-term economic boom by turning its entire economy toward war production and letting military spending do the work that consumer demand normally does. But that boom bought time, not immunity. The same sanctions that didn't crash the economy in year 1 are now compounding in year 4. Frozen reserves that can't refill the war chest, a banking system locked out of global capital, and an oil trade that survives only through discounts and workarounds that erode the state's revenue every single month. And the bill for 2 years of artificial growth is now landing exactly where these bills always land, on regular people, through higher taxes, higher prices, and a central bank holding interest rates near 16% to stop the whole thing from spiraling into inflation. Whether this ends in genuine stagnation, a deeper slowdown, or some kind of negotiated path forward depends on factors far beyond economics. But the economic story, on its own, is no longer the simple sanctions failed narrative that dominated headlines in 2023 and 2024. It's much more complicated than that, and much slower. Here's what I want to know. Do you think the West's sanction strategy was a failure that got lucky in year 4? Or a slow burn success that just took longer than anyone expected to show results? Drop your take in the comments. And if you want to understand the central bank chief who's been trying to hold this entire system together, Elvira Nabiulina, the woman walking the same tightrope Hjalmar Schacht walked in 1930s Germany, that video is right here. One more thing before the end card. If there's one thing this video makes clear, it's that even an entire country's economy can be reshaped overnight by decisions made thousands of miles away, decisions an ordinary person has zero control over. Interest rates, sanctions, currency values, government spending, none of it is something you or I can influence. What you can influence is whether your own income depends entirely on those forces, or whether you've built something on the side that doesn't. That's the real reason I got into affiliate marketing, through a platform called Wealthy Affiliate. It teaches you, step by step, how to build an online business through content and commissions, the same model that funds this channel. No experience required, and there's a completely free account to start with. If the idea of building income that isn't hostage to someone else's economic policy sounds worth a look, the link is in the description below.